Okay, it is now time to do that rite of passage for all 3D artists, and that is to model a wine glass. There's a number of different ways to do it. We're going to do it through extrusions, and we're also going to use a background image to do so. So the first thing is we have a new scene in Maya. We already have a project created from the last video. So I'm going to go to File and Set Project, and just make sure that I am using my week 2 components. Actually, I'm going to use my class prep project just because that's how I need to be organized, but you can use the week 2 project that you just made and click Set. So if you go home and open up your files on your computer, you'll have to do this process. Go to File, Set Project, and choose the right project. That way Maya knows where all of your assets are stored. I'll click Set. I'm going to hit Command-Shift-S to save as, and I'm going to call this Wineglass 2019 because I've done this a number of times before. And it's automatically going to my Project Scenes folder, which is great. And now I'm ready to begin modeling this wine glass. So I've given you all a reference image, and it looks like this. I found this image by going to Google and typing in wine glass, and this is one of the first ones that comes up. The specific shape of the wine glass does not matter, but the fact that we have a specific shape to model off of is important because it will make things much easier and look much better. So we're going to use this as a direct reference, and I'm not just going to keep it open on the other monitor. I'm actually going to bring it into Maya as an image plane. So to do that, when you bring an image in as an image plane, your viewport, the angle of the viewport matters, because that will be applied based on the angle that you're looking at it. So we're going to call this a front view of a wine glass. It could also be a side view or a back view because they are symmetrical that way. I believe it's radially symmetrical is probably the right term. So we want to go to the front view in the viewport. So I'm going to tap space to go to my quad view, hover my mouse over the front view, and tap space again, and now I'm in the front view. If you are looking for a faster way to change views, you can hold down the space bar, hold down the right mouse button, and now you have a list of all of your different views that you can go to. So I can go to front view from here, I can go back to perspective view from here. Now if I do that and tap spacebar again, now I have 2 perspectives because it was this lower left one that I was changing. So if you don't want to do it this way, or this is confusing, that's fine. Ignore it. You can just tap the spacebar and you'll be fine. But this is what can ultimately be a much faster way to navigate between viewports, because you don't have to hold down space and hold down right mouse button and wait for it to pop up to navigate. It's gestural. So if we know that perspective view is up, I can just flick up and go to perspective and back down to front and over to the top and back over to the right and go really fast. Now, if you go too fast, you can get into some weird workspaces, so you might need to slow down. But as you get more comfortable with it, that is a very fast way to change views. Just something to keep in mind. But it doesn't matter how you get there. You want to be in the front view, and we can add our image plane. So to add an image plane, there's a button up on the toolbar of the viewport. Okay, and it looks like a blue square standing up on a grid. It's just below the G in shading. I'm going to click on that. When I do that, it's going to open up the open dialog, and it's going to already be looking in the source images folder. This is why I had you copy that file to your source images folder, because Maya is going to automatically be looking there. We can choose our wine glass reference image and click open, and there it is in our scene. Before we actually start adding an object and shaping it into a wine glass, I want to make a couple of adjustments to this image. The first is I want to move it up so that the grid floor, like if we go to perspective view, you can see that it is actually a 3D object in the scene. But it's kind of going halfway through the grid floor, and I'd like to not have that be the case. So we're going to go back to front view. with it selected, I'm going to hit W to bring up my move tool. I'm going to move it up so that it is sitting on the grid floor. Now, something to consider here is the issue of perspective. Cameras take photographs with perspective because they live in the real world. In 3D applications, if you're dealing with the top, the front, the side view, you're dealing with orthographic views. And what that means is it's a projected view. It is not a real view. There's no perspective to it. And so there's going to be an inevitable mismatch. And reference images in general will never perfectly match and will never perfectly line up with what you want. So there's always going to be some sort of adjustment that you have to take into account. One of those instances here is we know the bottom of a wine glass is flat, right? It's not round like this, because if it was round, it was actually like bowed on the bottom, it wouldn't stand up. So we know that's the case. And we could set it here, but I'm actually going to set it so that about the midpoint of it is sitting on the ground. Seems like a nice average point for the base of the wine glass. Again, it's all interpretation, but this will work pretty well to get us the shape that we want. So I'm kind of going just about halfway down. Okay. Now, there's a couple other adjustments that I want to make. And for that, I'm going to go into my perspective view. I'm going to keep it in the quad view so you can see all four of them. Again, to illustrate some of the problems with an orthographic view, is I want to move this wine glass a little bit back in the Z space, in the Z direction, which is this blue arrow. Again, we can look at this widget in the lower left corner of the viewport to confirm which axis is which direction. But as I move this back, notice how in the front view it doesn't get smaller. Normally, in perspective, when something moves further away from you, it appears smaller. Orthographic view, again, doesn't have perspective, so it doesn't have that effect. That also means if you're looking at a model in an orthographic view, it's not really a true representation of how we see it. So make sure you're also looking at it in a perspective view to get a real sense of what it's going to look like, because they won't always line up perfectly. But I just want to move it back a little bit. I'll maybe move it to the end of the grid, something like that. It doesn't matter exactly how far. I just want it back a little bit. And then the last thing that I want to do is adjust the transparency or the opacity of my reference image. And to do that, I'm going to go to my attribute editor here on the side. It's also this third icon up here on the top right. You can also get there if you hit Control A a couple times. You'll see the attribute editor will pop up. So in the attribute editor with this grid or with this reference image selected, we've got a number of different options that we can adjust, but the only one that I'm really concerned with is alpha gain. Okay, that's your opacity, that's your transparency. Right now it's at 1. We can bring that down. I'm going to bring mine to 0.5 is good for now. My background image set up. I'm happy with it. I'm going to click on the attribute editor tab just to hide it and go back into front view. And now we can start modeling this wine glass. So whenever we model an object, the first thing you need to kind of do is just take a second to examine it and figure out the best way to start. So the way that we're going to be doing this is starting with a cylinder at the base, and then we'll extrude that all the way up. There are a number of different ways you could do this, but that's the way that we're going to be focusing on it for today, just for more practice with extrusions and edge loops. So to get started, we're going to add a cylinder. So I've got my cylinder added. I'm going to hit Control A a couple of times, and nothing's going to happen for some reason. So I'm just going to click on Channel Box Layer Editor on the side. And under the Input section, I'm going to click on Polycylinder 1. And this is where I want to make a few adjustments to the starting form. So by default, round things tend to have 20 subdivisions. You can see here, subdivision axis is 20, which means there's 20 edge loops around the perimeter. That's too many. We don't need that many edge loops to define the shape. It also means the more edge loops you have, the longer things are going to take to render, and the more complicated it can be to keep things looking smooth and even and pretty. So we could get away with 8. We could do 12. You could, if it was something that you weren't going to see close up, you could do 6. If it's a low poly game, you could certainly do 4, and then you've got more of a boxy situation. So I'm going to set my subdivisions to 8. Will be plenty. And then the height, I'm going to leave the height alone. I'm going to adjust it a different way. But radius, I'm going to select radius, and I'm going to middle click and drag and scale it out so it fits the radius of the base of my reference image. Okay, if you need to hit 4 to go into wireframe, you can do that, if that's easier for you to see it that way. Before I start manipulating this is where it says P cylinder 1, I'm going to rename it to Wineglass because naming is important. All right, I can also see that it's kind of tricky to see my my edges and my reference image at the same time, so I'm going to select my reference image. Let's see, it doesn't seem to want to select. So I'm going to go to my outliner, and I'll select my image plane from there. And then I'm going to go back to my attribute editor, and I'm just going to turn the alpha gain down a little bit further. .25 seems to work okay for me. Okay, so I've got it sized to about the right size, radius. Now what I want to do is I'm going to move the cylinder up so that it's sitting on the floor, my grid floor. So I'm going to go to translate, and by default the height is 2. So if I translate Y to 1, it's going to go right to the grid floor. All right. And then I'm going to go into vertex mode, select all of the top vertices, and I'm going to move them down to about the thickness of the base of the wine glass. Okay, something like that. Once I have that, now we can start extruding. So, in perspective view, I'm going to select one face, hold down Shift, and then select the rest of the faces. I also want to do a quick orbit around my base and make sure that I don't have anything else selected. I only want these top 8 faces selected. And then from there, basically what we're going to do is we're just going to extrude it up to define the shape of the wine glass. All right, and so there's a couple of different ways you can extrude. Or when we wanted to extrude, we did Shift right click, and we have extrude face right there. There's a couple other ways that you can do it. One is in the poly modeling shelf. One of the icons it's under the Arnold tab is extrude, so that will work. You can also go to the modeling toolkit, and there's an extrude function there. Or perhaps the fastest way is if I bring up either a move or, well, generally a move tool. You can also do it with rotate and scale. If you bring up move and hold down Shift and hover over the y-axis arrow, you can see that it says extrude. So if I click and drag from here, you see now it is extruding out additional geometry. Okay? So from there, what we want to do is I'm going to do this kind of in the broad strokes first, and then I'll go back and add edge loops to refine the shape. So first, in this front view, I'm going to move this up to about the base of the stem let's say, well, I guess we'll go right about here. Just kidding. We're going to go here. Okay. And then I need to scale it down. So I want to scale it in all directions. So I'm going to hit R a couple times to make sure that the center of the scale tool is highlighted. And then I will middle click and drag so that it lines up. Again, I'll zoom in here so you can see a little bit better. I'm also going to, one more time, make my background image a little bit more transparent. So I don't know how this is going to encode on YouTube. So I'll do something like that. Okay. Oops. So let me select those faces again. All right. So back to front view. So I scaled those down. Now I'm going to go back to my move tool. I'm going to hold down Shift, left click and drag on the extrude arrow, move that up. And I'm going to move it up to right before it starts to get wider again. Set it there. Then I'm going to Shift click and drag again to about here. I'll scale it once more. And I'm going to keep doing that. So Shift click and drag to extrude, scale it out, extrude, scale it out, extrude. I'll go all the way up to the top and then scale it in. Okay. So now if I look back in my 3D viewport, in my perspective view, you can see we have the rough shape of a wine glass. And if we were making video games in 1991, this would be a fantastic wine glass. But we are not making video games in 1991, so we have to go further. I'm going to jump into front view here. And as you are scaling your wine glasses down, you may run into this problem. If you scale it down and let's say that looks good, that's what I want, and then you go into your perspective view and you realize that it's oblong. What happened is that you scaled in only one direction. Okay, you can see that the x-axis handle here is what's selected, and that's what's highlighted in yellow. And you can't see that it's doing anything from the front view. It looks like it's scaling everything down. But in the perspective, it's only going in one direction. So what you need to make sure you're doing is you have the center handle highlighted. Okay? Then you're scaling in all directions. There's a couple ways you can keep an eye on this. You can either scale it from the from the quad view or the perspective view so you can see multiple angles. If you're scaling an entire object, you could keep an eye on the channel box and the scale values and make sure they stay even. It doesn't work for components. But also just make sure that you have that center one selected. So let's say I have the x-axis selected. If you, okay, and I'm in move. If I want to scale from the center, if I double tap R, you can see the first time I hit R, it brings up the scale tool with the x-axis highlighted. If I hit R again, okay, the shortcut for scale, it's going to reset it back to the center. So you can do that and make sure that you have that selected. From there, you can middle click and drag anywhere in the viewport and it will start the scale. You don't have to be right on top of it. Okay, so if you click right back on this, it's going to select the x-axis again. You're going to run into the same problem. So if you middle click and drag elsewhere, it will scale the whole thing. So I've got the center selected, middle click and drag, and now you can see it scaled everything uniformly. So keep an eye on and make sure that you're doing a proportional scaling when you want to keep that symmetry. So once you have the wine glass kind of created up towards the top, we want to create the cavity on the inside so this could actually hold wine. I'm going to do that much the same way. There's one thing I want to make sure we do, and that is give the wine glass some thickness. You never really want an object to be just one face thick. It should have some bulk to it, some real weight and heft to it. So with all these faces selected, I'm going to shift right click and go to Extrude Face. And instead of adjusting the thickness, I'm going to adjust the offset. I'm going to hold down Control, middle click and drag, and just bring it in a little bit to roughly the thickness of that wine glass. Okay? And then from there, I can extrude down just like we did on the way up. So I'm going to shift, left click on the move tool, bring it down, and I'm going to mirror what I did on the outside of the glass. But I just want to maintain this consistent thickness all the way around. Extrude it down again. And I'm keeping it not exactly on top of the other edge, just so that I can select them independently from this view. Just makes it a little bit easier. And then I'll extrude down one more time to the bottom of the wine glass and scale that in. Okay. And now we're at a point where this wine glass could actually hold a liquid. And if I hit 3 on the number pad and it smooths out a little bit, it looks pretty good. But the problem is if we are trying to replicate our source image, it's not following the reference exactly, because when I smooth it out, it's smoothing quite a bit and we're losing some of the definition between the stem and the base and the stem and the actual glass or the bulb part of the wine glass. So the way we do that, in order to kind of tighten up those transitions and define that curve more exactly and more precisely, is we need to add some edge loops. Now you certainly could have just done a bunch more extrusions along the way initially, and I probably would have, but I want you to have practice both with extrusions and edge loops. So we're going to do edge loops now. So I'm going to go to edge mode, and we'll start at the base. And again, we can just do this from the front view. With wine glasses, it doesn't matter which view you're really working in because it looks the same from all sides. But with objects that aren't cylindrically symmetrical, or radially symmetrical, I guess, you want to make sure you're always looking at it from different views, make sure it looks good from all angles. Just something to keep in mind. But for this base, I want this kind of more sudden upturn here in the base. So I'm going to shift right click on an edge and go to Insert Edge Loop tool. I'm going to open my options just to make sure they're set where I want them, and they're not. So I'm going to hit Reset tool, and I want to do equal distance from edge, and I can close those settings. And I'm going to add an edge loop kind of just off the bottom, this second edge loop here. And then I'm going to hit Q to bring up my selection tool, double click on that edge loop. Okay, you can see in perspective view I have the whole edge loop selected. And then I'm going to scale that down. And I'll scale it down here in the front view to about the base of where that starts to turn up. Okay. And then I can add another edge loop. So shift right click, insert edge loop tool. The settings retain or are remembered. So maybe I'll add one about here, and I'll scale that down. Okay. Now let's say I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm going to go up here to the top of the glass, and on the outside I want to get this nice curve a little bit more defined. So I'm going to add 2 edge loops at a time. So I'm going to go back to my edge loop tool. I can shift right click and go to Insert Edge Loop again, or I can over here on the left side you can see that it has my most recently used tools, and in this case it is the Insert Edge Loop tool. So I'm going to double click on that. Okay, so you can either double click on that on the side or shift right click and go down to the options box for Insert Edge Loop tool, because we do want to use multiple edge loops. I'm going to go 2, and I will click here and it adds them, and now I can scale those out. Now when you're scaling out multiple edge loops, you need to be careful with the direction that you're scaling, because if I just scale them out here, you can notice that they also get further apart from each other. All right, or if I scale them down, they get really close vertically, and I don't want that. I want them to stay the same vertical distance apart from each other. So what I'm going to do is in perspective. This is where these planar scales come into play. If I just choose this one, this box, it's a green box, you can see it's on the XZ plane. Okay, so it's just that horizontal plane. If I scale along that and keep my eye on the front view, you can see I can scale it and they'll stay the same distance apart from each other. So I'm going to scale that out to define that curve a little bit better. Okay, we'll go back to perspective. You can see we have that curve on the outside of the glass. Go back to the front view. If I hit 3 on the number pad, you can see that looks a little bit more pleasing as well, as this base has more of that direct kind of sudden upturn. You'll also notice that as we are smooth previewing this, it's generally getting smaller. Okay, so what we can do is we can add another edge loop around the base to the outside here. So I'm going to go bring up my options and go back to a single edge loop. And I'm going to add an edge loop right here. Okay, using an edge loop in this way, it's called a control loop. And what that does is now that I have that additional geometry there, if I hit 3 on the number pad, the wine glass doesn't shrink at the base anymore. Okay, it maintains the size a little bit better. We can also see that that smooth preview is causing the underside of the wine glass to bend in quite a bit. So we're going to add a couple more edge loops here. I'm going to add one there and one there. Okay, and you can see that that is allowing it to hold its shape and also kind of creasing that corner a little bit. Okay, so if I go back into object mode and look at this wine glass, you can see with a couple of extra edge loops to kind of control that shape, we can get some really nice forms. All right, and you certainly then would continue doing that all the way up the wine glass. At the top here is another important part, because we modeled in this consistent lip, but when we smooth it out, it comes to a point, and we don't want a pointy wine glass. So again, I'm going to go back to, go to edge mode, and I'm going to insert another edge loop right there. And again on the inside, and then one more in the center. Whoops, not there. Right there. And now I smooth it out, and you can see that now we have that nice consistent thickness. Okay, so edge loops are great for both adding geometry so you can add more detail and also preserving the geometry that you have. A great example of this is if I just add a cube here, just as an example. Oh, I added 2 by accident. Okay, so I've got this cube here, and if I hit 3 to smooth it out, you can see that it looks like a sphere. Okay, we covered that before. But if I add an edge loop to it, okay, I'm going to add an edge loop right here, and now I smooth it out. You see that that side stays a little bit sharper and retains its form a little bit more. Okay, the closer 2 edge loops are together, the more they're going to want to stay in that orientation. Okay, if I go and add an edge loop to the other side of the cube, but go even closer, and hit 3, you can see now on this side, it's an even sharper transition. So you can use that distance to define how smooth your transitions are. Okay, and if I add a couple more edge loops here, around each of the main edges and hit 3, now you can see that that cube still looks like a cube, but the corners are a little bit more rounded and they feel a little bit more real. Okay, so that's what you can do with edge loops to keep things feeling a little bit more realistic and like they have weight and presence. So as we finish up this wine glass, I'm not going to worry too much about getting the exact shape up here because it's just more of the same. But on the bottom, if you want to add another edge loop, you can see because the cylinder has all these triangles, if I want to add an edge loop just around this perimeter, I can't do that. Okay, I can't If I try to click and drag, it just gives me 1 point, and that's not what I want. So an alternate way of doing that with the top and bottom of a cylinder is to select the faces and then extrude them. And instead of adjusting the thickness, just adjust the offset. And now I've got that edge loop around the outside of my base, and I hit 3 on the number pad, and now I've got a nice crispy bottom edge. Another thing that I want to point out when working with edge loops is, let's say you get a little bit carried away and you add an edge loop here and you decide you don't want that. You can just hit delete on the edges, but if you do that, okay, it looks like I've deleted that edge thoroughly, but if I try to click on this vertical edge, you can see it's actually still divided into 2 edges. Or if I go to vertex mode, there's still a vertex sitting in the middle of that edge, which is not a good thing, because when you smooth it out, weird things happen, and that's bad. So instead of just hitting delete on edges or on edge loops, you want to hit Control Delete. Okay, if I hit Control Delete, it gets rid of the vertices as well and goes back to the clean edges as before. Okay, so Control Delete when you're deleting edges, not just delete